And we've extended that living beyond our means by issuing more credit, and there's going to be a reckoning there. The financial system as we know it is completely untenable, and there are going to be big changes. Once the majority of those changes happen, history shows time and again that people inherently help each other out. The more people prepare, the less likely that an exogenous financial shock is going to be a disaster.
Our economic system is actually a giant global Ponzi scheme. How that unravels is going to have big consequences for the average American.
America today is the mightiest nation since the dawn of man. Yet history tells us empires rise only to inevitably fall. The circumstances change, but the results do not. Now, there are those who believe America's destiny will be no different. One of these men is Nathan Hagens, born 1965 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. With a PhD in natural resources, this former investment banker was managing a hedge fund when he came to the conclusion our current economic system was unsupportable. He resigned.
Our economic system is actually a giant global Ponzi scheme. And the way that translates is a lot of this debt and credit that has been built may someday never be paid off. How that unravels is going to have big consequences for the average American.
Capitalism is going to have to be retooled, or it's going to completely go by the wayside. What we have now has been a failure. The future is going to look very different than the past in one primary regard, in that the world economy will no longer continue to grow. Until 12,000 years ago, humans lived on a hunter-gatherer, foraging lifestyle. And then we started to find and develop agricultural methods where we could grow things that we didn't need to eat that day. We could store them for many months or even a year. And then we started to live more sedentary lifestyles and develop technology, etc. And then in the 1700s, we basically hit the energy jackpot when we figured out how to use coal, and then subsequently in the 1800s, oil, and then in last century, natural gas. Now the question is, what's going to replace fossil fuels? Every American right now has 200 to 300 energy slaves standing behind them doing work that we take for granted. The energy in the taxi that got me here today, the lights in this building, our food system. The average food travels 1,500 miles to get to our plate, and that all uses energy. All these things are subsidized by a one-time endowment of fossil energy that is so powerful that for all human intents and purposes, it is indistinguishable from magic.
Hagens believes the current global depression is the beginning of an economic collapse that will intensify as natural resources run out and alternative energies fail to replace them in time.
Technology is in a race with depletion, and depletion is winning. People need to recognize, okay, we live on a finite planet, and we have virtually infinite wants and perceived needs. But those two trends are butting up against each other, and what are we going to do about it?
We've been so endowed with natural resources for 60, 70, 80 years, we have not really thought that this was a problem. There have been some recessions and even a Great Depression, but we've always reset from that. We build our institutions and our expectations assuming that this sort of subsidy will continue in the future. And now we've built a lifestyle that is no longer sustainable. We can live within our means, but only when we acknowledge that there are limits. And our economic system right now does not acknowledge that there are limits. The financial system as we know it is completely untenable, and there are going to be big changes.
The idea that our economic system is completely failing is hard to believe, but Hagens points to America's mountainous debt as proof. The balance between that debt and our available resources is delicate. When it tips, the system collapses.
We have built an entire industrial civilization on the assumption that there will be more every year. We now know that resources are harder to find, and in order to keep the system going, we've flooded the American economy as well as the world economy with more and more credit. We've created a large debt overhang, and right now we're kind of in this Wile E. Coyote moment where we've fallen off the cliff and the government is supporting the feeling that things are okay, but in reality, right around the corner, there's some very different trajectories. Basic needs, food procurement, water, just knowing that people are going to get fed is going to become more prominent in people's minds, just like it did in the Great Depression.
The 1920s were this kind of go-go period where a lot of people were invested in the stock market. On Black Tuesday, the stock market lost 12%, and it lost 40% 2 months later, and eventually the stock market from its highs in 1929 to its lows in the mid-30s lost 90% of its value. In the Great Depression, around 35 million people lived in families where no one had a job, out of a population of 120 million. So during that decade, the average income of those people that worked declined 40%. So it was pretty desperate back then. The government is attempting the same things that it attempted in the 30s by borrowing money and stimulating the economy. But the problem is we can't continue to inject money from thin air into a system and continue to think that it's going to hold together. You cannot solve a credit crisis by adding more credit, period.
The American economy rebounded from the Great Depression to become larger and more dynamic than ever before, reinforcing the theory of cyclical markets, in which booms are followed by busts, and then ultimately a bigger boom. Hagens cautions, this belief is more faith than fact.
I believe the United States is insolvent, and that some of these debts that we've incurred from the past are going to come home, and we're going to have to face the reality. The moment of bankruptcy comes when people want the money, when they want the claims to be paid off. America, unfortunately, is asleep with a lot of these issues, and part of this is due to cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when our brains don't want to acknowledge the gravity or seriousness of a situation. A good example is in Jared Diamond's book Collapse, where he talked about a dam was about to break, and people 3 miles downstream were really afraid, and people 2 miles downstream were like really freaked out. But people living within a mile of the dam, they weren't concerned at all. If things are too frightening and too threatening, our brains tune it out because it would affect our behavior and it would be too painful to accept. So peak oil and peak credit and the depletion of cheap fossil fuels and what that means for the end of growth, it's too overwhelming. The financial reckoning that's coming could include many different scenarios. It could be no more U.S. currency, and the U.S. currency is replaced by something else. It may happen that you have $100,000 in your bank, and the next day you wake up and you have 10,000 Patriot dollars or something like that. It's happened many times. People remember Weimar Germany in the 1920s, where there was the end of a system of claims, an end of a currency, and there was something that would replace it. The average American knows that something is wrong, but the problem is they don't really speak up and get really vocal about it because they don't know what to do.
Hagens feels this unprecedented financial crisis is the greatest threat to America today. The debate continues.
The problems are all interrelated. The economy,